In the mid-18th century, a certain Dr. White, who lived in Holland Wood, which is now a part of Oldham in Lancashire, had what can only be described as an unusual or even macabre consultation with one of his patients. The lady who consulted him was Miss Beswick, who owned a substantial piece of land known as Birchen Bower. The land included a sizable farm, woodlands, and the house in which she lived, a cross-shaped building known as Bower House. Now, Miss Beswick was, to say the very least, a wealthy woman, and the doctor, knowing which side his bread was buttered, was prepared to give more tolerance to the old lady's strange request than he would for anyone else. And strange her demands certainly were. You see, some years before, one of Miss Beswick's brothers had fallen ill and had been pronounced dead. The undertaker was just about to screw down the coffin lid when he noticed one of the dead man's eyelids flicker. The young man was lifted from the coffin and eventually revived, although the shock affected him so deeply that he never fully recovered and was mentally disturbed for the rest of his life. As a result of this horrendous near-premature burial, Miss Beswick developed an almost obsessive, morbid fear that the same thing might happen to her. And so, her instructions to Dr. White were very specific. When she was pronounced dead, her body was to be placed in an open coffin and was never to be buried. In addition, she was to be brought back to Bower House every 21 years and left there for a week. And so long as these conditions were fulfilled, the doctor would be allowed to take over the whole of her property. Well, how could the doctor resist such an offer? Oh, you'll not find it difficult to believe that he agreed. But now, another thread enters our story. In 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie's Highlanders invaded England and headed south towards Lancashire. Miss Beswick became convinced that the plundering hairy Scots would arrive at Birchen Bower and loot her considerable fortune. So the old lady collected all the money and all the portable valuables that she could lay her hands on and hid them. But she refused to tell anyone else where the treasure was hidden. And after the passage of a good few years, Miss Beswick became too old and infirm to run Birchen Bower any longer, and so she retired to a small stone cottage on the bank of a mill stream near the main house. Then, when she contracted her final illness, she begged the family to take her back to Bower House so that she could die in what had been her home for most of her life, and that she would then disclose the whereabouts of the treasure. Now, the family kept promising that they would move her the next day. Finally, of course, for Miss Beswick, there came a day when there was no next day, and she took the secret of the hidden fortune with her into death. After she died, Dr. White kept his part of their bargain by having her body embalmed with tar, wrapped with bandages, leaving just the face uncovered, and the resulting mummy placed in an open coffin. He kept the coffin in his own home for several years, and after his death, it found its way into the Manchester Natural History Society's museum in Peter Street in Manchester. There it remained for a century, until 1868, when it was removed, despite being a popular exhibit with the general public. The reason for its removal was a sorting and redistribution of stock. So the coffin and the mummified remains of Miss Beswick were finally interred at Harper Hay Cemetery in Manchester. The doctor had also been scrupulous in keeping the other part of the arrangement that he had made with the old lady, and Miss Beswick's body had been transported at 21-year intervals to Birchen Bower, where it had been left in the barn on each occasion for its week-long visit. And while the mummy was in residence, some very strange things happened. In the middle of the night, eerie noises came from the barn. To quote from one of the witnesses, "It was as if the devil was having a party in there." Strange lights shone from the building, a red, fiery glow which was so strong that neighbors rushed to the farm thinking that the barn was on fire. But when the doors were flung open, the lights went out and all was in order. When the family opened the barn in the mornings, the stock were often not there, though they had been safely locked up the night before. Horses were found wandering, and on several occasions, a cow was found up in the hayloft, despite the fact that there was no opening large enough for the animal to pass through, and it had to be removed using a block and tackle after a small portion of wall had been demolished, and it was then lowered down the outside of the building. Also, Miss Beswick's spectre was seen wandering the grounds, especially near the stream and a well and the pond where the horses were watered. While in time, Bower House was partly demolished, leaving only the southern wing, which was divided up into single-room apartments which were then rented out to poor weavers and their families. The tenants of the rooms very soon became used to the ghost wandering through their homes. One weaver, who revelled in the unlikely nickname of Joe at Tamer's, lifted a flagstone in the floor of his room in order to dig a pit for the treadle of his weaving loom. Now this flag was one where the spirit of Miss Beswick had been seen to stop and then vanish. When Joe dug down in the soil under the flag, his spade struck something metallic. Pulling it free, he discovered it was a rusty tin box. And when this was opened, it was found to be full of gold coins. Joe took one of them to a jeweller named Oliphant in St. Anne's Square in Manchester and sold it for £3.10. While the coins lasted, Joe and his family lived very well, and they were also undisturbed by any further visits from the ghost. However, she was seen for many years wandering near the well and the horse pond. Was she perhaps trying to point out the places where the rest of the treasure lay? We shall probably never know, since the site of Birchen Bower is now covered by a very large factory which until recently belonged to Ferranti and is now owned by the Mirror Group of newspapers. She last appeared there to about a dozen workers in 1956 during the middle of the night shift. Well, who knows? You might be able to persuade the Mirror Group to dig up the floor of their factory in order to find the treasure, but somehow I doubt it.